Hello, my name is Ryan Oates. Welcome to A Perfect World. One of the biggest problems in the United States and in the world is economic inequality, the gap between the haves and the have-nots. And I've got some good news from billionaire and political mega donor Jeff Yass.
We're almost at a point in America that everybody has all the stuff they need. No one's hungry, no one's cold, no one doesn't have some basic health insurance.
Problem solved. I guess we're done here. Thanks. Of course, none of that is true. In fact, the US is very unequal. One tool that researchers use to measure inequality is the Gini coefficient. It's a measure of a country's annual income inequality. And among wealthy countries, the US has one of the highest levels of income inequality. Beyond just differences in annual income, we also have high wealth inequality. Wealth being the sum of everything you own minus what you owe. The top 10% of Americans hold 67% of wealth, 2/3, while the bottom 50% hold just 2.4% of the wealth. Not to mention the racial wealth gap. In the US, white families have on average 5 times as much wealth as black families. I want to be clear that I think that building wealth is a good thing. When we as a society create wealth in an inclusive way, we can use that to solve problems. We can invest in research to cure diseases. We can use it to end homelessness, like Finland is doing. We can make everyone's lives better. But when that wealth is shared unequally, when it goes into the hands of a very small group of people, that can actually be quite dangerous. So today, let's look at why the US has such high levels of inequality, why exactly that's a bad thing, and how we can fix it. I recognize within myself an implicit bias against inequality. My brain is short-circuited to think that inequality is bad because it's bad. It instinctively feels unfair to me. But in recent years, I've challenged myself to slow down and articulate why exactly inequality is bad. And here's what I've found. Many people in the US, myself included, believe in the idea of the American dream. The idea that the United States is, or at least should be, a land of opportunity, where if you work hard, you can succeed. The word for this in economics is economic mobility, the ability to move up or down the economic ladder. And research shows that the higher the rate of a country's inequality, the lower the rate of mobility. This finding is so consistent that it actually has a name, the Great Gatsby Curve. According to the OECD, there are no countries with both high inequality and high mobility. So if we want the American dream to be a reality, then we need to address economic inequality. But that's not the only problem. Inequality is also associated with higher rates of crime, shorter life expectancy, higher rates of homelessness, low trust in institutions, and political inequality. I want to dig into that last one. Political inequality is the idea that the wealthy have more political influence. Gabriel Zucman, an expert on economic inequality at UC Berkeley, explains.
For most of the population, wealth is safety, security is a good thing. But for the very, very rich, wealth is not safety, wealth is power. And so an extreme concentration of wealth means an extreme concentration of power. The power to influence policy making, the power to influence markets.
And we're seeing that power most blatantly now with Donald Trump appointing a record 13 billionaires to his cabinet. And Elon Musk, the world's richest man, is making light of this, calling himself First Buddy. Now, a lot of people, myself included, are concerned about the fact that his wealth and the fact that he spent over $277 million to back Trump and Republican candidates has given him undue influence. In President Biden's farewell speech to the country, he warned Americans about the threat of the consolidated power of the ultra-wealthy.
Today, an oligarchy is taking shape in America of extreme wealth, power, and influence that literally threatens our entire democracy, our basic rights and freedoms, and a fair shot for everyone to get ahead.
Let's be clear. The Democratic Party is also influenced by billionaires. 83 billionaires supported Kamala Harris for president in 2024, and some of those billionaires pressured her to relax her antitrust enforcement and let some monopolies go unchecked. In an interview after the election, billionaire Mark Cuban said that he thought that he had had some influence on Kamala Harris's policies.
Were you able to have any influence on policy at all? I know there was some discrepancy between unrealized gains, and that was something you thought was a kind of a non-starter. Did you have some influence on policy there?
I think I did. I mean, I talked a lot about unrealized gains, and so that was one area. Another area was crypto.
There you go. Billionaires and a highly unregulated cryptocurrency. Sounds like a recipe for success. All that to say, regardless of political party, concentrated wealth leads to concentrated political power. I made another video about money in politics if you'd like to learn more about that. So given that economic inequality has so many negative effects, let's look at how the US became so unequal and how to fix it. While there are many reasons why the US is unequal, today I want to talk about two of them. The first, capitalism. French economist Thomas Piketty wrote a best-selling book titled Capital in the 21st Century. He explains how capitalism, when left to its own devices, leads to economic inequality.
I've been working on the history of income and wealth distribution for the past 15 years, and one of the interesting lessons coming from this historical evidence is indeed that in the long run, there is a tendency for the rate of return of capital to exceed the economy's growth rate. And this tends to lead to high concentration of wealth, not infinite concentration of wealth, but the higher the gap between R and G and the higher the level of inequality of wealth towards society tends to converge.
Basically what you suggest is growing wealth concentration is kind of a natural tendency of capitalism. And if we leave it to its own device, it may threaten the system itself.
So according to Piketty, a feature of capitalism is that it leads to a concentration of wealth. Again, markets can do a lot of great things. They can solve problems, but they can also create problems like concentrated wealth. So capitalism, cause number one. Next, let's look at how government policy has contributed to inequality through the way we design our taxes. A major theory that has influenced our taxes since the 1980s is the idea of supply-side economics. This is the economic theory that the rate of macroeconomic growth will be higher when tax rates are low. So according to this theory, if we cut taxes on the rich, they will invest more to grow the economy, and the benefits would trickle down to workers and the broader economy. I'll be honest, whenever I hear someone say that giving tax cuts to the rich will somehow help everyone else, my gut reaction is to be a little skeptical. But again, I think it's important to recognize that bias and look at the evidence. And so I looked at the evidence. A 2012 report from the nonpartisan Congressional Research Service found that the top tax rates appear to have little or no relation to the size of the economic pie. However, the top tax rate reductions appear to be associated with an increasing concentration of income at the top of the income distribution. This is not the only research showing that low taxes on the rich actually don't contribute to economic growth. A wider reaching study published in 2020 found similar results. Researchers traced the impact of tax cuts for the rich in 18 wealthy countries over 50 years. And they found that those tax cuts had no impact on per capita GDP. In other words, the tax cuts did not grow the economy. The research indicated that tax cuts for the rich may not accomplish much more than allowing the rich to keep more of their riches. Because of course, giving tax cuts to the rich will make them richer. Trickle-down economics sounds inherently counterintuitive, and that's because it is. To put it generously, this theory is optimistic. But if I'm going to be honest, I think that the political leaders that are promoting trickle-down economics are dangerously deceptive. And here's why I think that. In the 1980s, President Ronald Reagan was one of the biggest proponents of supply-side economics. In 1981, he gave an address about the economy, and he implied to the American public that his upcoming tax cut, the Kemp-Roth tax cut, would primarily impact ordinary people.
All of you who are working know that even with cost of living pay raises, you can't keep up with inflation. In our progressive tax system, as you increase the number of dollars you earn, you find yourself moved up into higher tax brackets, paying a higher tax rate just for trying to hold your own. The result? Your standard of living is going down. We must go forward with a tax relief package. I shall ask for a 10% reduction across the board in personal income tax rates for each of the next 3 years.
Here, Reagan is addressing the audience directly. You pay too much. We're going to cut taxes in a way that helps you. But the true intent of the Kemp-Roth tax cut was uncovered the same year when a member of Reagan's own administration said the quiet part out loud. David Stockman, Reagan's director of the Office of Management and Budget, told a reporter, "The general argument was that in order to make this palatable as a political matter, you had to bring down all the brackets. But, I mean, Kemp-Roth was always a Trojan horse to bring down the top rate, that is the tax rate for the rich." So what happened? Reagan's presidency brought two major tax cuts. The first, the Kemp-Roth tax cut of 1981, reduced the tax rate for the wealthiest Americans from 70% to 50%. The second brought that top rate as low as 28%. So over the course of 7 years, from 1981 to 1988, the taxes for the rich were cut in half. And since then, it's stayed relatively low for the rich in comparison to the years before Reagan. In 2003, Warren Buffett famously pointed out how low his taxes were.
I've used this illustration before, but I'm paying about the same percentage of my income to the federal government as my secretary does.
In 2017, President Donald Trump passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 that also disproportionately helped the rich. And to his credit, he was pretty open about it.
Because you're all people that have a lot of money. I know 20 of you and you're rich as hell. We're going to give you tax cuts.
And he fulfilled that promise. The Tax Policy Center found that 65% of the cuts went to the richest 20% of Americans, and 20% of the cuts went to the richest 1%. By 2019, the 400 wealthiest families paid a lower tax rate than the middle class. So when we put this in the context of the research, it's no wonder that decades of tax cuts for the rich have resulted in skyrocketing wealth for the top 10% and ballooning wealth inequality. All right, enough about the problem. How do we fix it? According to experts, one of the biggest tools we have to reduce economic inequality is progressive taxation, where people who have more money pay a higher tax rate. Before we dig into the research, I want to acknowledge that this conversation was already happening at the time of Reagan's tax cuts. Jesse Jackson, who was considered a young protege of Dr. Martin Luther King in the 60s, went on to be the first major black candidate for president in 1984 and 1988, the elections after Reagan's first and second terms. And at the 1988 Democratic National Convention, Jackson spoke about the impact of Reagan's tax cuts and the need for higher taxes on the rich.
7 years later, the richest 1% of our society pays 20% less in taxes. The poorest 10% pay 20% more Reaganomics. Reagan gave the rich and the powerful a multi-billion-dollar party. Now the party is over. He expects the people to pay for the damage. I take this principal position, convention, let us not raise taxes on the poor and the middle class, but those who had the party, the rich and the powerful, must pay for the party.
Now, there's a whole separate conversation about how we spend that money in a way that reduces inequality, like childcare, education, healthcare, housing, and public transit. But today, let's focus on the specific forms of taxation that reduce inequality. We'll organize our ideas based on a 2023 article by 3 world-renowned experts on inequality: Thomas Piketty, Emanuel Saez, and Gabriel Zucman. Based on this article, we will focus on 3 types of progressive taxation: income taxes, wealth taxes, and inheritance taxes. As I mentioned before, the income tax rate for the top 400 families is actually lower than the middle class. And part of that is because of what kind of income it is. There are 2 categories of income. There's income from labor, where you do work and you get paid for it. And then there's income from capital or investments. This is where you buy shares in a company, their value goes up, and then you sell them for a profit. The wealthy disproportionately make their income from capital gains. And in our current tax system, that capital income is taxed at a lower rate than income from labor.
People like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos didn't become the two richest people on the planet by being paid a salary. Instead, they like to be compensated in the form of shares in the companies that they run. Shares, though, are very different to a salary. You only pay tax, capital gains tax, when you sell shares.
The top tax rate on capital gains is 20%. By contrast, wages, salaries, bonuses are taxed at 37%.
Other sources have made a similar distinction. The OECD and Brookings Institute both found the difference to be about 15 percentage points. But the point here is, since the Trump tax cuts of 2017-2018, taxes on capital have been lower than taxes on labor. And Zucman, Piketty, and Saez argue that we need to have a comprehensive income tax, an income tax treating labor and capital income flows alike. And there's some good news here. We've actually done it before. Here's Gabriel Zucman talking about the income tax rates in the 1950s.
The US invented progressive income taxation with very high top marginal income tax rate of more than 90% in the middle of the 20th century. And, sometimes when you talk about that, people say, oh, but nobody, really paid those rates. The US might have pretended to tax the wealthy under Roosevelt and subsequent administrations, but never genuinely did so. And so we take that seriously and we try, we compute in the book what was the effective rate paid by the wealthiest Americans, and that's the result here. We find that the top 0.1% highest earners paid about 60% of their income, all taxes included, during the middle of the 20th century, and then you had this big decline in tax progressivity. So the point here is that the US tax system really was progressive, not only on paper, but also in actual fact, and today, is basically not progressive or barely anymore.
Look, I like to look forwards and not backwards. Okay, the history of the United States is full of injustice. But in this one narrow sense of progressive taxation, let's make America great again. Because when we do that, great things can happen. For example, in Massachusetts, where I live, we had some real success with progressive income taxes. Take, for example, the story of Raise Up Massachusetts. In 2022, this coalition of 150 community organizations, faith-based groups, and labor unions worked together to pass the Fair Share Amendment. This amendment to the Massachusetts Constitution created an additional 4% tax on income above $1 million. So under this policy, the first $1 million you make in a year is untouched. Then each additional dollar above that is taxed at 4%. Importantly, that included capital gains. The text of this law says that the revenue from this tax has to be spent on education and transportation, roads, bridges, public transit. But passing this legislation was not easy. They used the state's ballot initiative system, collecting 155,000 signatures to get it on the ballot in November. The teachers' unions and other organizations used their collective spending power to spend $26 million on the initiative. Keep in mind, these groups represent over 200,000 people. Meanwhile, some wealthy people who didn't want to pay taxes tried to stop the amendment. Of the $13 million spent to try to stop the amendment, half of it came from just 6 people. Those wealthy donors include the chair of New Balance and the owner of the Patriots. Here's just another example of how a series of Supreme Court decisions have given the wealthy and corporations more political power. But in this case, against the odds, the collective action of community groups and organized labor unions were able to win. This simple 4% tax on income above $1 million was able to raise $2.2 billion in annual revenue. That was enough to pay for programs that promote economic mobility, like universal free lunch in schools and universal free community college, $175 million for early childhood education and care programs, and $110 million for public transit, including free fares and investment in paratransit for the elderly and people with disabilities. All this to say, when the rich pay their fair share in income tax, the American dream can be that much more of a reality, and we can make life better for everyone. But as it turns out, the inequality of annual income is only one part of the equation. An even bigger part is wealth inequality. The problems for using income taxes as a solution for economic inequality are twofold. The first problem is that billionaires often don't report any annual income.
Leaked tax returns analysed by ProPublica found that Jeff Bezos paid no federal income tax in 2007 and 2011, while Elon Musk didn't pay any income tax in 2018.
A lot of these extremely wealthy individuals make most of their money by the increased value of their assets. However, in our tax system, people are only taxed when they sell some of that stock. But if they don't sell their assets, if they just hold on to it, then they don't owe any taxes.
Not only is there an under-reporting problem, but Thomas Piketty explains that wealth inequality is just always higher than income inequality.
The general level of wealth inequality are always higher than income inequality. So remember, for income inequality, the share going to the top 10% was between 30 and 50% of total income. Whereas for wealth, the share are always between 60 and 90%. Okay, so that's fact number one, and that's very important for what follows. Wealth concentration is always a lot higher than income concentration.
According to a paper they wrote for the Brookings Institute, Zucman and Saez seem to agree on this point. And based on the evidence I can find, the idea that wealth inequality is larger than income inequality is still true today in the US. For example, in 2022, about half of all income went to the top 10%. But in 2021, 2/3 of all wealth was held by the top 10%. So because wealth is more concentrated than income, many scholars have argued that a better strategy for fixing economic inequality is to tax wealth. A 2020 article from the Annual Review of Economics found that wealth taxes can compress the wealth distribution relatively quickly because they basically act as a capital gains tax higher than 100%. You're essentially taxing their wealth faster than they can accrue new income. And this can also be redistributed toward public programs that promote economic mobility, like the ones I mentioned before. Elizabeth Warren, when she was a candidate for president in 2020, actually worked with experts like Zucman and Saez to create her version of a wealth tax. It was also supported by Jesse Jackson, who I mentioned before. Here's how her wealth tax would have worked.
It's time for a wealth tax in America. So here's how it works. Anyone who has over $50 million in accumulated assets, your first $50 million is free and clear. Your 50 millionth and first dollar, you got to pitch in 2 cents. And 2 cents for every dollar after that. And a few more cents for every dollar of wealth over $1 billion. That's the basic idea that will generate $3 trillion over the next 10 years. Because here's the thing, you built a great fortune in America, good for you. All we're saying is, when you make it to the top, to the top of the top, to the top of the top of the top, pitch in 2 cents so everyone else gets a chance to make it in America.
A progressive wealth tax like this would dramatically reduce inequality within the current generation's lifetime. But there's a separate problem, which is extreme intergenerational wealth, the large inheritances passed on to one's heirs. The tool for that problem is an inheritance tax. So if wealth concentration is so high, and it's not necessarily due to a person's income, the obvious question becomes, where did that wealth come from? And the general answer to that question is that the ultra-wealthy passed down their money in the form of large inheritances. In 2023, new billionaires earned more of their money from inheritances than from work. An article from the Review of Economic Studies argues that because inheritances play an important role in wealth accumulation, the taxation of such transfers will affect social mobility. And I want to be clear, I think there's a certain beauty in the idea of an inheritance, that your final act can be doing something kind for the people that you love. But I don't think that's a justification for the kind of extreme wealth transfers that we're seeing today. For example, David Koch giving his heir $61 billion when there are people who don't have a home. I think we can find some reasonable limitation for how much people can inherit. In 2023, Piketty, Saez, and Zucman outlined an argument for inheritance taxes focused on equal opportunity. They wrote, from an equal opportunity viewpoint, it seems to make sense to tax earned income, or self-made wealth, for which individuals can be held responsible, at least in part, less heavily than inherited wealth, for which individuals can hardly be held responsible. As you may know, people cannot choose who their parents are. So the inheritance tax is one way of making the American dream more accessible to more people. The US actually does have a form of inheritance tax. It's called the estate tax, or as opponents like to call it, the death tax.
You know, he has a plan for the death tax. He's planning on raising the death tax pretty significantly. My own view is we ought to kill the death tax. You paid for that farm once, you shouldn't have to pay for it again.
And yes, we are ending the horrible and very unfair estate tax, also known as the death tax.
But there are also a lot of small business owners and owners of family farms and ranches who have to spend tens of thousands of dollars a year trying to avoid the death tax in order to preserve their family business for another generation.
As you can see, many politicians, disproportionately Republicans, try to frame the estate tax as an issue that affects a large number of farmers. But that's deceiving. The US estate tax is actually very progressive. The Tax Policy Center estimates that only 0.14% of descendants ever pay the estate tax. In 2025, only estates of nearly 14 million or more are subject to the tax. So you could pass on $14 million in inherited wealth and pay $0 in taxes. After that first 14 million, inheritances are taxed on an increasing scale, with the highest rate being 40%. And I think even that is relatively low. I think we could tax extremely large inheritances a lot more progressively. Bernie Sanders actually proposed something along these lines in 2019.
Bernie Sanders proposing an estate tax that would be the highest in over 50 years. His plan would kick in on estates valued at $3.5 million or more, as compared to the current level of $11 million. So it would bring it back to about 2009 levels. Not so bad, but the big change, that's the rate. Now, it's a sliding scale that for Sanders' plan would start at 45% on estates over $3.5 million. But for estates over $1 billion, get this, it would rise to 77%.
Now, in 2025 dollars, I'm not sure if 3.5 million is the exact right starting point, but a tax similar to this, where it becomes progressively higher, would reduce the ultra-wealthy's ability to pass vast amounts of wealth onto their heirs. A progressive inheritance tax would reduce economic inequality, and increase mobility. All right, as we come to a close here, I know what you're thinking. How would you ever pass any of this? The US political system is captured by the wealthy. And I get it. It's easy to despair at the fact that in the last 40 years, economic inequality has just been getting worse, and it's hard to see things getting better anytime soon. But in his TED Talk, Piketty gives a glimmer of hope.
In the current political context, how realistic are those? How likely you think that it is that they will be implemented?
Well, I think if you look back through time, the history of income, wealth, and taxation is full of surprise. So, I am not terribly impressed by those who know in advance, what will or will not happen. I think 1 century ago, many people would have said that progressive income taxation would never happen, and, then it happened. And, even 5 years ago, many people would have said that bank secrecy will be with us forever in Switzerland, that Switzerland was too powerful for the rest of the world. And then suddenly, it took a few US sanctions against Swiss banks for a big change to happen, and now we are moving toward more financial transparency. So I think we can make progress if we have a more pragmatic approach.
Things have changed before, and who says they can't change again? So if you're interested in making progressive taxation a reality, I first suggest that you use your individual power to vote for candidates who believe the rich should pay their fair share. Next, you could work with others to build political power. You might support the campaigns of those candidates. You might consider running for office yourself. Finally, you could join an organization fighting for progressive taxation. I'll list a few of them here. Of course, there are plenty of state and local organizations, like in Massachusetts, where I live, there are several organizations working on progressive taxation, like all of these groups. If you want to learn more about wealth inequality, I recommend Robert Reich's documentary Inequality for All. I also recommend anything by Thomas Piketty. His book, Capital in the 21st Century, is a bit dense, But there is a documentary based on the book that is a bit more accessible. He has another book called A Brief History of Equality that I found to be realistically hopeful. If you want to learn about tax avoidance, another part of this problem that I didn't quite get to, I encourage you to check out Saez and Zucman's Triumph of Injustice, How the Rich Dodge Taxes and How You Can Make Them Pay. I want to end on a note from Jesse Jackson. He said, "The American dream is one big tent. One big tent. And in that big tent, you have 4 basic promises. Equal protection under the law, equal opportunity, equal access, and fair share. And in my view, progressive taxation is one way we can fulfill those fundamental promises of the American dream." See you next time.